Welcome to Step Into the Story. Incredible conversations of how the Bible changes lives, changes families, and changes communities across the globe. And here's your host, Phil Tuttle of Walk Through the Bible.
Welcome to Step Into the Story. Each time we get together, we have a conversation with someone about their life, how the Bible has changed everything for them. We explore the intersection of God's story and your story. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. I'm excited about this new guest. It's someone I don't know much at all. Jana Harmon, welcome to Step Into the Story.
Thanks, Phil, for having me. I'm excited to be on with you today.
Jana, your bio is quite intriguing to me. A teaching fellow. We need to do something about that fellow word. I don't know what.
It doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me at all.
You're a teaching fellow for the Theos Institute here in Atlanta, adjunct professor of cultural apologetics at Biola. A rich educational background culminated with a PhD in religion and theology from the University of Birmingham in England. That's all the official part. But now let's get to know you as a person. Just tell us a little bit about your growing up and your background. And, were you in third grade going, someday I want to be an associate professor, adjunct professor of apologetics, cultural apologetics specifically? I mean, what is the path that God brought you on to have you doing what you're doing today, Jana?
Well, that's a good question. I really do believe that the Lord has planned who we are, what we do in advance, and that so many times we have no idea what His plans are. We're just along for the great adventure. And where I am now is a very far distance from where I had seen myself growing up, and I was born into a conservative Christian family, a lovely Christian home. Grew up in the 60s and 70s, and it was the time where traditional values were esteemed. And so I really didn't see myself as much more than a housewife. With kids, I never saw myself in the academic world or what I'm doing now. That was a far cry from that. But I grew up, went to college, and I will say, in terms of my journeying, spiritually speaking, I grew up in a denomination that was a bit, I guess you could say, constrained, restricted, legalistic. And so I didn't grow up with I grew up with obedience to the Lord, but there was not a real love relationship with the Lord. And so it really wasn't until my 30s where you talk about the Bible intersecting your life, where I actually the Lord graciously pulled me out of that denomination. When I learned all about Jesus and what He had done, I learned about grace. And that's when my life, spiritually, I would say, just started taking off.
Wow.
But again, it really had nothing to do with what I'm doing now. I was just enjoying learning to walk with the Lord and learning really at that time, moving into a more comprehensive Bible study rather than proof texting, and learning what the Word was, and learning the grand story, and learning my place in it, and the Lord's great plans for us, and my security in Him. So it took me a while to kind of situate myself in that.
Well, Jana, you and I have, I don't know the specific labels or anything on it, but we have a very similar background in terms of church upbringing. And I praise God for my parents who weren't really that strict or legalistic and showed me, plenty of grace at home. But offline, we'll have to compare notes sometimes, because just by what you're saying and not saying, it's a familiar path that I'm very glad to not be walking any longer. I'm big on grace and mercy, and I think it's so interesting to me what you're doing now. And again, I want to talk about both of these topics, but tell us some about the C.S. Lewis Institute. I mean, it's here in Atlanta, but it exists in other cities as well. I just need to tell you that is something both my wife and I, that's on our bucket list. I mean, the Chronicles of Narnia deeply impacted me. I'll never forget reading the Screw Tape letters years ago, which C.S. Lewis wrote, and going, that's exactly the cheap stuff that Satan is pulling in my life. I get it now. And it made it easier to resist some of those things. And Mere Christianity just was mind-blowing for me when I read it in college. And I want to go back. I want to read all of those things as well as many of his other books. But before we talk about the Institute specifically, if no doubt, I mean, we got a whole nother generation listening to this. Other than The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I mean, why is it that C.S. Lewis stands the test of time and has so much to say to every generation? What do you think it is about him and his writings?
That is a thought-provoking question. It seems to me, no matter where I turn, whether it's intellectual forums or just very casual forums or people or conversations, somehow C.S. Lewis's name comes up. He seems to be able to relate, obviously, to the child and through his imagination and his imaginative writings to the most erudite adult, and because of his profound thinking, and he was trained as an extremely logical man who is vastly, widely read. So he is respected in all manner of thinking and of life and of living. He has something to say. I think when I think about C.S. Lewis, it's not only his thought and his ability to relate complex ideas in simple ways, but also the way that he seems to know the human condition very, very well.
That's gold right there.
He's able to relate truth in a way that we know them, not only intellectually, but also experientially as well. And we go, yeah, that's so right, and that's so true. That's incredibly profound.
Yeah, and I mean, to be able to mix just that undeniable logic that even if you want to disagree, that's like you can't question how he's getting to where he's getting, but to be able to wrap that in a level of creativity and story that captures your imagination, because I listen to a story differently than I listen to a sermon. If it's a sermon, I'm in evaluation mode, right? I'm questioning things. I'm looking for the gaps in logic. And you tell me a story, especially if it's a personal story or there's some authenticity of emotion in it, I drop my defenses and I open my heart in a new way. And he's just, I don't know, there's a stunning amount of giftedness in one person there. So the C.S. Lewis it's not a school where one enrolls, and it's what exactly is it, and how is it accessible to those of us who are listening to our conversation today?
I'm so glad you asked. We all esteem and love the writings of C.S. Lewis, but I think there's oftentimes a thinking that the C.S. Lewis Institute is all about the writings of C.S. Lewis and really looking at those more closely. Now, that is a part of it, but the primary goal of the C.S. Lewis Institute is actually to develop disciples like or as in the legacy of C.S. Lewis, someone who, by his own example, not only embraced the Lord with his mind, but also with his heart and his life. And so the C.S. Lewis Institute seeks to make disciples who are more fully orbed in their understanding of their walk, mind, heart, and hands. So their keystone offering really is a discipleship program whereby if someone was interested in really taking their faith to a deeper place, they would sign up for the Fellows program. It's a year-long discipling program where each month you read a particular curriculum of thoughtful writers, both contemporary and past, over a certain topic. And then you come together and there's a group teaching, and then there's a small group discussion over what you've been reading. And so there's also a mentor who is a graduate fellow who walks alongside of you as you're encountering these ideas and really trying to process them through your own life, your own thinking and your own living. So it really is, it's a nice adjunct to any kind of discipling program that the church offers. It's meant to really be a service to the church, as it were.
Yeah, and we'll put a link where people can find out more about that in our show notes. But I'm serious, Jana. That is, my travel schedule has not made it possible up to this point, because when we do it, we want to do it right. But that's definitely something that Ellen and I are. Maybe we'll run into you there. The other part that just jumped out at me as I was, you can call it research or say I was creeping on your life, either one. But the other thing that just jumped off the page was I don't know very many people where their doctoral research, yours at the University of Birmingham in England, and dissertation, for so many men and women, that ends up being something that lives on a shelf in a library someplace, lots of times not super practical. I really don't mean that as critically as it's coming off, but that's just the reality of really higher education research. Yours, by contrast, has opened up an amazing ministry for you. Let's talk some about your original research and what it was that you studied, and then we'll talk about how God's using that now. But tell us about that original research, where you got the idea from it, why you were passionate about it, and how some of that unfolded.
To give you a little bit of context for where this came from, my husband and I, as we were leading small groups in our church, we began to lead seeker-oriented groups. And it became very quickly very plain to me that I did not have very good answers to give those who had come in from outside of the Christian worldview. And so that set me off on a journey of wanting to know why I believed what I believed and how the Christian worldview held up against other worldviews, including naturalism or the atheistic worldview. And when I came through my graduate work in apologetics, I then observed the intellectual argument between those who were between Christianity and the Christian worldview, which I was convinced, very well convinced, that it had the best answers for what reality is, who we are in our humanity, all of those things, that it had a very strong and compelling case, especially against naturalism or the atheistic worldview. But I watched for about 10 years where it seemed like no matter what evidence or arguments were presented from the Christian worldview, that it seemed to fall flat or unconvincing to the atheist. And I thought, I was reading Francis Schaeffer and Blaise Pascal about and appreciating the fact that there's more to us as human beings than just our intellect, that there are other things going on. Perhaps there's our heart, our passions, the things that we like and things that we want. and other experiences in our lives that might prevent us from desiring God, or even if it is true, or even if Christianity is true or God is real. So I wanted to take a more holistic look, really, at, generally speaking, why we hold beliefs. Is it just rational, or I'm talking about growing up? I grew up in a family that was a conservative Christian family. There are those social issues, there are cultural issues going on, why we have the beliefs that we do. So particularly, I wanted to know if, for the atheists, what informs their non-belief, and what would it take if the truth is really on the side of the Christian worldview. What would it take for an atheist to become a Christian? Not only what would it take, but what did it take? And so through my PhD work, I interviewed over 50 former atheists to hear their stories of how they moved from a very resistant form of non-belief to coming to become very avid and strong believers in Christ, some of the most incredibly on fire followers of Christ that I know. And it was very eye-opening, very inspiring, very enlightening to see the ways and means that the Lord uses to bring someone so far away, so seemingly unreachable, to himself.
And now you fast forward that to today, and you've got the Side B podcast. I love the tagline, how people flip the record of their lives. My kids would probably look at that and go, what's the other side of the record? I don't get that. But I would explain it to them, and just like I had to teach them what the hands on the clock really meant, that it's not always digital.
Right, of course.
But,
yes.
Your podcast, and this intrigues me. I've listened to a few of them, just really authentic conversations with men and women who were, not just how did they come to trust Christ as Savior, but they were atheists. They were convinced that there is no God. And the story, and while each one is individual, I'm wondering, between your research back then, but also the Side B podcast, are there commonalities of what brings a person from darkness to light, especially somebody who's just dead set against belief? What are the common patterns that change seems to follow, if there are some?
That's a great question. As you know, we all come to belief in different ways. And we all resist, or those who are resisting God resist for different reasons. And so sometimes the reasons why you resist may be connected to what might open the door. So what I mean by that is that there are those who actually resist God. Say, for example, someone had a really abusive childhood, or a tragic event happened in their life, and they wonder, where was God? So they're feeling as if God wasn't there, that God doesn't care, and may even become extremely angry about that. Like the very first podcast, Mike Arnold tells a story of how his house burned when he was 7 years old. He believed at 7 that Jesus loved him. And then his house burns and he loses 2 of his brothers. And he said he became a strong atheist after that. At age 7, he said, I wouldn't even set foot into a church for a wedding or a funeral. And that lasted for 20 years because he was so angry at God for that. So if you think about that in terms of what informs the atheism, that's why it's so important for us to know someone's story and not just try to present something to them when we don't even know who they are. But it's interesting, okay, you think about the fact that he perceives God as not good. So what would break down that barrier? Well, he ended up meeting Christians his wife became a Christian. It angered him, so he went over to their home and of the folks who had actually brought his wife to Christ, and he found he was incredibly disarmed because he found these warm, loving people who sat down with him over a cup of coffee. He didn't know what to expect. He went in for a fight, a battle. Instead, he found him, who was by this time a very angry, unlovable man. He found a couple who wanted to sit down with him and love on him and listen to him. And as he said in his interview, they treated me like I was a human. Well,
wow.
That's just love. There was something that started barely breaking down the barrier, but this went on he found something attractive, right? There was something good there that he didn't think was possible. And these religious people represented God to him. So they invested days and months and weeks into this mate. And he would argue and he would, do everything he could to resist God until finally, it came to a point where this couple had loved on him, had given him all the answers that he was looking for. And finally they said, "What are you holding against God?" And he had no more answers because they had poured out love on him.
Yeah.
And he ended up accepting Christ. So, but yet, that's one personal story. So, but you can see, I have seen a pattern of those who have dismissed God because he was absent or he didn't care. And then they found that, well, perhaps maybe he does, and that was through people who represented God who cared. So that's just one pattern, I guess you could say.
Yeah,
but of course,
for sure. That
as well.
That aligns with the ones I listen to. Also, a lot of times people will define apologetics as, well, that's when you essentially paint people into a corner with logic and they have no choice but to throw up the white flag of surrender and say, your beliefs are better than my beliefs. And I don't know many people who have met the Savior by being, just overcome with the logic. Certainly our faith is reasonable and there's a solid foundation of thought, but there's almost always that relational component of somebody who represents Christ well. And I was just at a Bible conference speaking, and the other speaker there talked a lot about how much of evangelism is actually becoming a good listener. And Jana, I just want to affirm in you, listening to how you interact with guests, you are a tremendous listener who the next thing out of your mouth after somebody else talks is not just the answer that you've prepared that's going to counter what they say. You genuinely listen, and I'm 0% surprised that God has chosen to use you in the way that he's using you. You just need to hear me say that as somebody who doesn't know you. We've never even met face to face, but that is the hallmark of your ministry. And I hope you're encouraged to hear me say that.
Wow. That really is encouraging. It's funny how the Lord makes us all very unique, and I am an introvert by nature. It has been my natural posture to speak little and to listen much. A lot of that out of perhaps shyness or insecurity. And so I've learned over these many years to actually become a good listener, and it's something, again, kind of natural to me, but I do see it as a gift that the Lord has also blessed and enables me to, I guess, enter into others' stories.
We'll definitely put a link so that the folks who are listening to this can experience the Side B podcast for themselves. But I want to ask you, I think almost all of us have somebody in our in our life who we've said, oh, that person is probably unreachable. Maybe we've tried before. Maybe last Thanksgiving dinner ended up in a big argument, and it's like, I'm never bringing up that topic again with them. And we can brand people with a new scarlet A, the label of atheist, like that's a permanent situation that, well, maybe if God appeared like he did on the Damascus Road, or if he wrote it on the wall of their house, maybe he would break through. But I'm not going to be part of that process because that person's just, they know more than I do. They just scare me. What would you say to just encourage the average person like me that are listening to this today from the stories that you've heard, and you've heard a bunch of them now, if you could give some advice to those of us that have somebody in our world, might be a coworker, a neighbor, worst of all when it's a relative, what could you say to help the average person do things that would be compelling and make the gospel attractive through our living and our conversation? What would you say?
In my experience, what I have come to appreciate really is, first of all, you need to remain in someone's life. You don't, just because they may believe in a different way or in an off-putting way, perhaps they hate the way that you believe and they think it's ridiculous. What you need to do is remain in a way that the Lord remains with us. Remain in a way that is an embodied form of Christianity that is authentic, that is, it matches what you say you believe. It's generous, it's hospitable, it's loving, it's kind. It's all of those things that they cannot provide an argument against. It's providing an embodied picture of a meaningful, contented life. It's something you don't know where someone else may be struggling with a lack of contentment or satisfaction. They may even be having doubts about their own worldview. So in one way, you need to remain and be embodied Christ in their life, no matter what they say, no matter what they do. And the other thing I would say is you need to really actually, let me just say this. There are negative stereotypes that atheists and non-believers and skeptics hold of Christians. One of them is that they're not good. And that's what in terms of being embodied Christ, that's how you break down those stereotypes and surprise them and build plausibility of, oh, you're actually normal. Oh, you're actually kind. Oh, you actually are loving. You're not as hateful as I thought you were. So you're living out, breaking down those negative stereotypes and building up personal plausibility. The other thing is that there's oftentimes the negative caricaturizing of Christians as being stupid or ill-informed.
Right.
And that's on us. We need to actually do due diligence to understand not only our own Christian worldview, why we believe what we believe, but we also need to understand their worldview as well. When you understand your own worldview, the Christian worldview, it gives you such calm confidence so that you don't have to be defensive. You don't have to rise to anger and just shout out, mantras and slogans like they do to us. There's a way in which we can engage in meaningful conversation in a very, again, a calm and confident, quiet, confident way by asking questions and just engaging, helping people to see that perhaps what they believe in isn't all what it's all cracked up to be. It's not only, in the traditional apologetics world, that we have answers for what we see outside of ourselves, in the universe, that we have incredible arguments for the existence of God through the origin of the universe and the cosmos and fine-tuning and looking at the cell and the information and all that kind of and philosophical arguments. But we also have the best explanation for who we are in our own humanity. And I think oftentimes we miss that as Christians, that the Christian worldview is the only one that gives us dignity as humans, that gives us consciousness and free will. It's the only worldview that actually explains that there's a reality to love. And all of those things that make us human and valuable, the only thing that actually can say, wow, that's really right, or that's really wrong. Christianity is the only worldview that can offer that makes help us make sense of our own world. So we have a lot. And it's just a matter of understanding whose we are and acting like that. And also understanding why we believe what we believe and being able to engage in a meaningful, non-defensive way, asking questions and really just staying the course.
Yeah.
I've been looking at again, what is it that opens the door? That's that $1 million question. And if I had to sum it up, I was just looking at this today, I would say, there's something that disrupts their world or their understanding, whether it's someone who comes into their world that is not, it surprises them, it disarms them in terms of what Christianity is or who Christians are. Sometimes people live with this, what I would call a disruptive longing. That is, that they want something more than their world or worldview is offering them. Obviously, we see such devastation in culture these days, so much substance abuse and depression and anxiety and all of these things because their world or their life, their internal sense of being it's not what they want, or they're looking for something more. And sometimes that kind of thing, if someone will actually look at their own worldview and say, well, does my own worldview even offer what I'm looking for? They have a kind of dissonance about that, an emotional or existential dissonance that their life isn't what they're really, really wanting, and they become open to something else. Sometimes it really is a disruptive event or crisis in their lives, and change, circumstances change, and people become open. That's why it's important to kind of be in the sidelines and being engaged in their life, so that when those moments happen, when people are so apathetic or against God, but then you're there when those things do happen, when they are ready, that you're there in their life, giving them an embodied picture of what life could look like.
Jana, that all sounds a lot like how Jesus himself interacted with people, so winsome, so genuinely concerned for them. Not, if you'll just get your act together, you'll be welcome in my presence. Whether it was calling Zacchaeus down from the tree and going to his house, or kneeling down with the woman who was about to be stoned and writing in the ground, or engaging the woman at the well, and not leading with her immoral reputation, but bringing the offer of living water to her. And I just again thank you so much for the hard work that you've done with the research, but also for opening that up in a non-academic way through your podcasts, to just show us that sometimes it is just staying in somebody's life, even when they reject what we believe or even want to reject us, but just saying, no, I'm in it, regardless of if you ever embrace my views or not. And by the way, the same things that keep you up awake at night sometimes keep me up awake at night, and just being real about it. So thank you so much for sharing. And this is what we want to do every time we get together on Step Into the Story, is find out find out how God is building, He's writing the next chapter of His story in our story. And Jana, you've just communicated that so well for us. I think what you've shared is going to help a lot of people. And thank you for being my guest today, and look forward to the next time that we get together for another conversation. If there's any way that we can serve you at Walk Through the Bible, check out the resources that are there at walkthrough.org, and tell your friends about Step Into the Story, especially those who may be trying to figure out how to build relationships to share their faith in an authentic way with others. Jana, thank you so much for being my guest today on Step Into the Story.
It's been a real pleasure, Phil. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for the Step Into the Story podcast, powered by Walk Through the Bible. We'd love to hear what you think by giving us a review on iTunes or Google Play. Also, don't miss a single episode by clicking the subscribe button. If you'd like more resources to help you explore and live God's Word in your daily life, visit walkthrough.org. That's WALKTHRU.org. Walk Through the Bible. Take a walk, change the world.